My name is Don Schott. I'm the president of the Board of Curators of the Historical Society. And on behalf of the board and of the society, welcome to what I promise you is going to be a wonderful, wonderful event here tonight. We live in interesting times, interesting in lots of ways, and one of the ways that is of particular interest to me these days is the whole subject of how do we teach history, how do we share history, how do we demonstrate history in our public museums, in our national parks, at our historic sites, and even the question of, does history really matter? How important is it for us to understand history? And I'm one of those people who's a passionate believer that history does matter. Understanding what happened in the past helps us. It's not just entertaining and enjoyable, but really helps us make sense of what's happening now and makes us better decision makers in terms of what we should be doing in light of what's happening now. And, you know, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here with this crowd, but if you believe in any of those things I've just said, you are in for a treat tonight because you will hear a great lecture, and I promise you at the end of it you will have all sorts of lessons that we can take with us to make us think even more deeply about why we believe that history matters, and perhaps make us better in articulating to others why it is so important that we understand our history as we go through making all the decisions we have to make as a society. I am so thrilled about the lecture you're about to hear that I'm actually going to shut up and stop talking in a minute so we can get to it. But first, I want to introduce to you Christian Overland. Christian is now the Ruth and Hartley Director and CEO of the Wisconsin Historical Society. He came in when Ellsworth retired in 2018, and we were so lucky to drag him away from the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, which is, I'm sure many of you know, a very well-recognized and well-regarded institution and museum. Christian was the Executive Vice President and Chief History Officer at the Henry Ford, and he's just been a wonderful addition to us here at the Wisconsin Historical Society. Our mission, the mission of the Society, is to help people connect with the past by collecting, preserving, and sharing stories. And Christian absolutely lives that mission and helps instill that into the staff and to all of us that are associated with the Society, and does a terrific job of that, including helping us shepherd through the construction of a new history center. Those of you who've been down by the Capitol see the cranes are now up at the hole in the ground that is where the new history center will be built. And in 2 years from now, you can all come and enjoy that. But in the meanwhile, we'll have a wonderful lecture to listen to and to tell you more about the James Madison Lecture Series and our lecturer, Christian Overland. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for the board members that are here tonight as well, too, from both of our boards. I also want to give a shout out to the entire staff of the Wisconsin Historical Society. I am proud to be a member of that staff. If you went upstairs to the reading room in the library, you saw some of our North American history collections, but you also met some of the most passionate archivists and librarians that we have, and it's all of the staff and collections. The James Madison Lecture Series focuses on early American history, but also another part of it, too, is really honoring the people of the past that have helped us share, collect, and connect people to history, too. Merrill Jensen, who was a professor at the UW-Madison here in the Department of History, was a fantastic mentor and a great historian of the early American Revolution. So this lecture series honors his work. We could not do this alone and create it free unless we had support too. So support from the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. They've been instrumental to help us support the series over the years, helping us build an endowment too. Along with, actually, what's really great about this, the estate of John A. Peters contributed to the endowment building, and many others. So it's making it possible for you to actually be a part of this series. And I also want to thank Jeff, who donated tonight's books, his second book, The Pursuit of Liberty, that's here for us. So this year it's my pleasure to introduce to you James Madison lecturer, Jeff Rosen. And a little bit of a story, you can't help it, right? You're talking to a historian type of thing. But Angela Titus, who's sitting in the front row, she's our chief program officer and assistant deputy director. We were in Williamsburg planning with states for 3 years. We went there from 2003, 2024, 2025, working with states across the union and organizations like Jeff's organization, the National Constitution Center. Jeff gave a great keynote on the pursuit of happiness. And, you know, as happens sometimes, two people from Wisconsin got up and approached Jeff right away and said, "You got to come to Wisconsin." And so that's how we got Jeff here. And so 2 years later, we're here. So Jeff is actually the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's also professor of law at the Georgetown University Law School and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. He was previously legal affairs editor of the New Republic and staff writer at the New Yorker. Jeff's new book, The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Again, you're receiving this tonight. The public is going to have a chance to get it October 21st. So you can have a good read with your book clubs and then brag about it, okay? So other books that include, too, is The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers of Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, as well as he's published Conversations with RBG, Ruth Justice Bader Ginsburg on life, liberty, and the law, as well as biographies of Louis Brandeis, as well as William Howard Taft. Jeff is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and also he's a graduate of the Yale Law School. In 2024, the French government recognized Jeff as a Chevalier in the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. So, sort of a knighthood from France, right? A little bit of a knighthood. So, I want you to give a warm Wisconsin welcome to my colleague and your tonight's James Madison lecturer, Jeff Rosen.
Hello, fellow history lovers. There we go. I am so honored to be in Wisconsin, and I am blown away by this incredible crowd of lifelong learners who showed up last night in Green Bay and tonight here in Madison to learn about history. It's inspiring to see the vigor and vitality of the Wisconsin Historical Society and the incredible staffers who put those primary texts upstairs, including Shelley Zhao, an intern who looked for pamphlets that used the word "the pursuit of happiness" throughout American history and had that upstairs, along with some of the most significant pamphlets from Hamilton and Jefferson in all of American history. The Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton's Pacificus Letters, where he first introduced the unitary executive theory that's at the center of the Supreme Court debates today, and Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which upstairs was open to the page where he expresses the most troubling and racist views of the entire books. There was just a treasure trove of learning up there, and it was so exciting to see the text with you. It's also an honor to be here in a lecture co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Christian was just giving you a sense of the significance of this incredible project, which is overseen by the great scholar John Kaminsky. John and his colleagues in the 1970s decided to put online the texts of the ratification debates over the Constitution. After the Constitution is proposed in Philadelphia by the convention, there are debates in every state. And John collected them and put them online, and is just finishing now. The Bill of Rights volume is the culmination of this incredible project. Do you know how exciting it is to go for the Pennsylvania ratification debates and see James Wilson, the guy who came up with the idea that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign, a brilliant scholar, but also very arrogant. He makes a point, and he makes a claim about Blackstone and popular sovereignty. This farmer, William Finley from Pennsylvania, who's an anti-federalist, says, you know, he goes home and he gets a copy of Blackstone. He comes in the next day and says, I think you've misstated the law. In fact, Blackstone says something different. And Wilson just won't concede a moment, and he says, young man, I'll forget more law in one day than you'll ever learn in your lifetime. Really bad move as a debating move, and it's just an inspiring example of the self-taught farmer who's leading the Anti-Federalists bests the kind of arrogant, aristocratic would-be Democrat, and it's all in the primary sources. So I want you to go online and read those ratification debates because they're riveting, along with, John has put online, he has a book and an online resource of the founders on the founders. You can see what Hamilton and Jefferson said about each other, and it's not pretty. You can see John Marshall calling Jefferson the great Lama of the mountain, and Jefferson responding that Marshall is full of twistifications and he's so untrustworthy that Jefferson won't even tell him the time of day, but he'll reply, "I don't know, sir, I can't tell," because Marshall will twist his words against him. All this is in the primary text, and this is a really significant service to American history. So this enthusiasm is genuine. It so happens that you were lucky enough in Wisconsin to have two of the major sources for studying the primary texts of American history ever. So what an honor it is to be here. So I'd like to tell you today about The Pursuit of Happiness and The Pursuit of Liberty. And The Pursuit of Happiness is a book about my effort to start an unusual reading project to understand what the founders meant when they put those words, the pursuit of happiness, in the Declaration of Independence. And what I learned changed my life. It changed the way I think about how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen. And I learned that for the founders, the pursuit of happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And I want to tell you how I came to that realization and how it changed the way I think about American democracy. And then I'll tell you about this new book, which I'm so honored to be able to give you. It is indeed hot off the presses, and it's about how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson, about national power versus states' rights, and democracy versus rule by elites, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution has defined all of American history and can cast some light on our current constitutional debates during this anxious time. So here's the story about the pursuit of happiness. It was a series of synchronicities that led me to realize that both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson chose as their definition of the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. Here is how it happened. I was reading the section in Ben Franklin's autobiography where he says that in his 20s, he resolved to achieve moral perfection. An excellent resolution for all of us in our 20s. And his way of going about this arduous task was to make a list of 12 virtues that he later expanded to 13. And they included virtues like temperance and prudence and industry and cleanliness and order and resolution. And he saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. Ba-dum-bum. And he made a chart and he put the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week, bless you, on the y-axis. And every evening he resolved to put an X mark in the box next to a virtue where he fell short. He tried this for a while, found it was incredibly depressing because there's so many X marks, and he gave it up after a while, but he felt he was a better man for having tried. I knew about the system. As it happens, a rabbi in Washington, D.C. suggested that a friend and I try a version of the Franklin system translated into Hebrew. There was a Hasidic rabbi in the early 19th century who admired Franklin's system so much, he translated the virtues into Hebrew. It's practiced today under a system of character improvement called Musar, which means character in Hebrew. And without knowing that it came from Franklin, we also tried it. And we put an X mark every night where we fell short. We found it's unbelievably depressing. And we gave it up even sooner than Franklin did, but we also felt improved for having tried. So I knew about the system, but what I hadn't noticed is that in his autobiography, Franklin illustrates his virtue project with a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations that said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville on the beautiful UVA campus, a temple to Jefferson everywhere, and on the wall of the hotel room of the Boar's Head Inn was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And they looked remarkably like Franklin's list. They included silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. And resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Jefferson leaves one of Franklin's 13 virtues off of his list, and that was chastity. But what really struck me is that when Jefferson was asked to illustrate his list and share the central meaning of happiness, he also would quote this book, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And he chose a longer passage. He copied this out from when his dad died at the age of 14. And whenever anyone asked him about the secrets of happiness, this is the passage he would share. And it said, "He who's achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he has achieved the calm self-mastery of which we are in quest. He is the happy man." So I thought, I've got to read this Cicero book because it was so important for both Franklin and Jefferson in defining happiness as a quest for virtue, for calm self-mastery, for tranquility of soul. But what else to read? Then I found this golden reading list that Jefferson would send to anyone who asked when he was older how to be educated. And he would send this to kids who were going to law school. He'd send this to his friends who were building private libraries. The list is absolutely extraordinary. You've got to check it out. It was remarkable for its scope and its schedule. The scope includes literature. Jefferson loved the work of Lawrence Sterne and the poetry of Alexander Pope, and political philosophy and history and science, and what caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy. And sometimes Jefferson called it ethics and sometimes natural religion. And at the top of this section, 10 books. First, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, gleaming there, calling out to be read. And then Cicero's On Duties, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Epictetus, Seneca, and then some Enlightenment moral philosophers, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Bolingbroke, David Hume. What struck me about the list is that I hadn't read any of the books on it. And I've had the privilege of this extraordinary liberal arts education. And I am so grateful every day to the remarkable teachers in high school and college and grad school and law school who kindled my love of English. I was an English major in college, and political philosophy and history and law. But despite this wonderful education, I missed these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in college in the 80s. And I remember in the 80s, which I can see, I bet some of you remember, was the Greed is Good decade. Remember Tom Wolfe? Yes, indeed. Gordon Gekko, Bonfire of the Vanities, Go, You Do You. And I was looking for an alternative to the hedonism and materialism, the greed is good ethos that's celebrated by popular culture. I was an English major in college and I was studying the Puritans. And although I was inspired by the Puritans, their rigorous theology was not doing it for me. First, because I'm Jewish. And also because the Puritans really took seriously the idea that salvation or justification can only come by randomly given grace, not works and not even faith can justify. Some are bound for heaven, others for hell, and it's a question of grace. And I was asking whether a purpose-driven life, a spiritually meaningful life, a life of alignment with the divine, could take place by reason and reflection and good works rather than simple grace or doctrine alone. And what I didn't realize, that this is exactly the question that the ancient philosophers set out to answer and that the founders set out to inscribe into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So that's why I decided to read the books. The other thing that completely motivated me was Jefferson's schedule. He said, you've got to get up every morning before dawn, 2 hours before dawn, read the moral philosophy before dawn, watch the sunrise, then read political philosophy and history while the mind is still fresh, then lunch, then scientific and technical and mathematical subjects, then dinner, then you're allowed some poetry and Shakespeare for mild amusement before bed, and then dinner, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. So I do not, wow, indeed, I don't know what got into me. It was COVID, we had more time, I thought I should read the books, I don't know. But I decided to try a version of the schedule, not the whole day, but the morning. Got up every morning, read the moral philosophy for 2 hours, watched the sunrise, which remains the most extraordinarily beautiful experience that anyone can have any day. It was such a gift to see these glorious sunrises every morning. And then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I'd been reading that morning, which sounds, I know, incredibly weird. And I'd not written sonnets before, but the goal was just to take notes on the reading in some easily digestible form. It was a kind of way of keeping myself accountable. So that's what I did for a year, and this reading project changed my life. I learned, as I said, that for the founders, happiness meant being good, not feeling good, the pursuit of virtue rather than pleasure. But I also learned much more concretely what they meant by virtue. Virtue is an abstract phrase. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Because those terms aren't self-defining, it's hard to know what they meant, until I discovered Pythagoras, who was the guy who Aristotle got his definition of virtue from. I didn't know that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that weren't enough, Pythagoras is also a guru and sage who lives on the island of Croton and divides the soul into 3 parts: reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and says it's our duty each day to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions so that we can achieve the calm tranquility that defines the golden mean and represents the essence of the pursuit of happiness. Aristotle translates that into a chart at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, and he has a series of virtues, and for each one there's an excess and a deficiency. So we seek not exuberance or despondency, but moderation. And that's the source of the 4 classical virtues: temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. Each seeks a golden mean between the emotional extremes. The point isn't to lack emotion or passion, but to moderate or modulate it with reason. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg summed up the classical wisdom which she told me that her mom gave her, which is to avoid unproductive emotions like anger, envy, and remorse. They will distract you, her mother told you, from productive work and from useful pursuit of your best self, your best talents. Words like self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self. Today we would call it emotional intelligence, emotional self-control, self-mastery. It's best summed up by a phrase that Ken Burns uses called, the classical understanding of the pursuit of happiness means being a lifelong learner. I had the incredible privilege of doing a podcast series with Ken Burns that we've just launched. It's called Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. And I had a long conversation with Ken Burns about his morning practice of reading from Tolstoy's Book of Wisdom, which is selections from the classical and ancient moral authorities and spiritual wisdom. There's a passage that's circulated to an email list. Ken responds within minutes of getting the daily passage about his own reflections on the virtue in question. His contributions are like aphorisms from the classics themselves. They're incredibly thoughtful. And on the podcast, he just talks about how hard it is every day to put into practice this effort of spiritual self-mastery. And then we match that with a great American historian talking about one of the founders, Stacy Schiff on Franklin, Alan Taylor on Jefferson. It's just was a meaningful effort to reflect on the founder's own path for self-discovery. So that is what helped me understand the founder's conception of the pursuit of happiness. Another thing that helped me understand it was the Stanford marshmallow test. Some of you may have heard that in the 1970s, researchers at Stanford gave very young kids who are 5 years old a choice. They could have 1 marshmallow if they demanded the marshmallow immediately. If they could wait for 15 minutes, they got 2 marshmallows. The kids who could wait did much better later in life. They did better in school and in their relationships because they could self-regulate and they could think not of their immediate impulses, but their long-term interest, and also think of others and of the public interest. And it's amazing how, for all of the different expressions of it in Greece and Rome and the Christian and Enlightenment sources, using reason to moderate passion always comes down to impulse control and thinking of others, getting over yourself, of getting over your ego, overcoming self-love, as the founders called it, and serving our best self and ultimately serving the divine. So that was the classical understanding of the pursuit of happiness. Then in the happiness book, I set out to tell stories about how the founders applied this wisdom in their own lives. And what was so striking was not that they were perfect, because they were human and they fell short all the time, as all of us do. But what's striking to me is how self-reflective they were about their efforts to be better people, how candid they were about their falling short, how often they reproached themselves for making a total hash of things and for their own betrayal of their own ideals, and how this quest to be lifelong learners defines so many of their lives. After telling the story of Franklin, I begin with John and Abigail Adams, who, when they meet in Boston, decide to make a list of each other's faults. Not a good dating strategy. But they get it from Pythagoras. It's Pythagoras' dating strategy, because he says every day we have to make a list of each other's faults, ask how we've accounted for the virtues. It's all in his golden verses. And they've read Pythagoras, and they decide to try it. So Abigail has a problem. John is one of the most vain and self-regarding men of his age, and he's always storming about the fact that he's not getting enough credit for writing the Declaration of Independence or being the true source behind the revolution. She soft pedals this very diplomatically. She says, well, you are so brilliant that some people might find you intellectually intimidating. That's her version of his self-focus. And he responds with typical tact, well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she responds without missing a beat, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture. They go on to have one of the great intellectual, romantic, political, and spiritual friendships, partnerships of all of American history, as expressed in their incredible letters, which are so beautiful, and give yourself the treat of reading the Abigail and John letters. And then they take all of their efforts for self-improvement out on their oldest son, John Quincy Adams. Friends, I thought that having a Jewish mom in New York could be challenging. It turns out that having a Puritan mom in Boston is even tougher, because Abigail was relentless. She's constantly exhorting Quincy, use your powers of reason to moderate your passions. He who calms his passions is greater than he who takes a village, she says, quoting the proverb. And as a result, Quincy Adams, in addition to constantly chafing at his mom's nagging him to be more perfect, is constantly beating himself up for falling short of his and her ideals to be perfect. And remember, the injunction to be perfect comes from Matthew, from the New Testament. Be perfect, even as the Lord is perfect. And Quincy Adams takes this seriously. So at the age of 30-something or other, he's going from achievement to achievement. He's just turned down a U.S. Supreme Court appointment because he thinks his duty is to remain in Russia as the minister to St. Petersburg. And he writes, if only I had more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He sets a very high bar for himself. But as it is, I'm spending too much time at the theater, and I'm drinking too much Madeira, and I'm making a total hash of it. Nevertheless, he goes on to greater and greater achievements. He's Secretary of State for James Monroe, where he writes the Monroe Doctrine, and then he becomes President of the United States. And then two tragedies beset him. He loses re-election in 1828 to Andrew Jackson, and then he experiences the tragedy of seeing his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commit suicide. George Washington Adams can't deal with the pressure. Adams understood the terrible burden of naming his oldest son George Washington. In addition, Adams is always exhorting the son to be perfect and writing him letters from a Christian father to his son, which are inspiring, but that's an awful lot of pressure. He descends into alcoholism and he jumps off a steamship. And Adams doesn't know how he can recover, how he can find the strength to go on. And he decides to seek wisdom and solace in his books. He spends a year both reading from the Bible, which he does closely every day, and rereading his favorite book, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. Just cannot make it up. He reads it in Latin, which he's a master of. And this experience of rereading Cicero and the Bible convinces him to become one of the greatest white abolitionists of his age. He hadn't previously been devoted to the eradication of slavery, but a passage in the New Testament where Jesus promises to free the captives convinces Adams, based on his own close reading, that slavery violates the Bible as well as natural law. Adams writes sonnets about his own reflections. He walks along the Potomac and sums them up and writes this gorgeous abolitionist sonnet, "Who but shall see that freedom is the prize?" And he goes on to become one of the great abolitionists, according to Frederick Douglass. He goes back, he's elected to the House from Massachusetts, the only former president to go to the House. He denounces the gag rule forbidding the reading of abolitionist petitions. He denounces slavery and introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He votes against the Mexican War. He then suffers a stroke on the floor of the House, observed by the young Abraham Lincoln, who's a congressman from Illinois. And his last whispered words as he's carried to a couch are, "I am composed." And he gets that from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. Remember the passage Jefferson would send out to what's the meaning of happiness? The perfectly self-composed man, serene in the face of tragedy and death. It is he who has achieved virtue and happiness. It's just this extraordinary, mindful, ennobling death of a virtuous life. So that's John Quincy Adams. I was also inspired by the reconciliation of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In many ways, this reading project was an act of devotion and inspiration about the act of deep reading itself. And I'm so struck that after Jefferson and Adams broke during the Revolution, reconciled after the election of 1800, which is the bloodiest in history. The country almost came to civil war. The first political parties are formed with Adams and Hamilton at the head of the Federalists and Jefferson at the Democratic Republicans. Despite that, they reconcile. Abigail sends a lock of her hair. John sends Jefferson a copy of John Quincy Adams' book on Cicero's rhetoric. That's his, atonement gift. And they start corresponding. And what do they want to talk about as old men? Not politics, but their reading, and in particular, comparative spirituality. And it's just amazing how excited Adams is by reflecting about the fact that Pythagoras, who he reads closely, may have traveled to the east and read the Hindu Bhagavad Gita. And Adams, based on his own readings of translations of the Hindu Vedas, sees with extraordinary accuracy that the central message of Hinduism, renounce and enjoy, renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal salvation, is precisely the same as the Stoic dichotomy of control. Don't try to control the thoughts or emotions of others. Focus on controlling the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and emotions. Exactly parallel. But Adams just wants to prove that Pythagoras read the Bhagavad Gita, and he's worried that Joseph Priestley, who is translating the Bhagavad Gita, didn't live long enough to complete the translation. Jefferson says, "Good news, he lived. I'll send you the book from Philly." Adams is just so excited to have a copy of the book, and he thinks this will show that all the religions of the East and West can be summed up in the axioms that he attributes to the hymn of Cleanthe to Zeus: love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. The same two injunctions in the Hebrew Bible, the Lord our God, God is one, love God with all your heart, soul, and might. Those are the two axioms from Deuteronomy that Jesus insists are the core of the New Testament as well, and Adams sees the similarities between those in the East and West. It's just dazzling. Jefferson, who's also, based on his own reading, has concluded at the end of his long life, he's no longer a Stoic, but an Epicurean. But he means by that not a hedonist, a wanton pleasure seeker. That's a libel on the Epicureans by the Stoics, according to Jefferson. Instead, the Epicureans, properly understood, our master Epicurus, insists that we should rationally contract our desires so we can virtually meet them. In other words, not try to abandon all pursuit of virtuous pleasure, but just pursue it in moderation. So that's Jefferson's reflection, and that's another beautiful correspondence. Read the Adams-Jefferson letters. There's nothing better. This brings us to a central and important question. What about Jefferson and slavery? How is it possible that this apostle of reason, frugality, and industry, who never stopped insisting until his dying day that slavery violated the Bible and natural law, not only owned enslaved people, but only freed them on his death, and the only people that he freed were his own kids. He kept a promise to Sally Hemings. She only agreed to come back from Paris if he agreed to free their kids on his death. He kept that promise, but he freed almost no one else aside from 4 Hemings relatives. And all the while, he lived during his life while exalting the virtues of frugality and industry as a Caligulan emperor at Monticello. And he surrounds himself with luxury and gilded ottomans and mirrors and tufted sofas and French wines, even as he's posing as a Welsh farmer living on the virtues of the self-governing shires. And he also makes the avoidance of debt the centerpiece of his political philosophy, and says that no generation should impose its debts on the living, which is why he thinks there should be a constitutional convention every 19 years so that the dead hand of the past can't bind the present, even as he's living so extravagantly that he's in incredible debt when he dies, and his whole plantation has to be sold to pay off his debts, and parents are separated from kids, and his fantasy is exposed for the hypocrisy that it was. How is it possible? For me, a very revealing passage came from Patrick Henry, who, after he gave the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in Richmond, said, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And that, exactly, that kind of moment of brutal candor. I know it's wicked and immoral, but I like the lifestyle, and I just can't give it up. I don't want to give it up. That was Jefferson's view too, and the view of most of the Virginia enslavers of that generation. They didn't justify slavery as a positive good, as the next generation of wicked enslavers led by John Calhoun would come to do, but instead they just never stopped denouncing it, but liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. It doesn't absolve Jefferson, but it does help us understand his mentality, which was shared by others of his generation. Contrast Jefferson with Washington. Also an enslaver, he frees his enslaved population on his wife's death, but he also provides for their education, and he represents virtuous self-mastery more perfectly than anyone else of his age. That's the source of his greatness, is his extraordinary emotional self-control. He manifests it in always controlling his temper. He has a vigorous temper, but he is never seen to lose it in public, except on 2 occasions. Once when he's disobeyed on the battlefield, and second when the Senate disrespects him when he delivers an in-person address as president. But his greatest moment of self-mastery is at Newburgh in 1784. This is just after the war, but the troops are in danger of mutiny because Congress won't pay them because the Articles of Confederation are so weak that there's no ability to raise taxes to pay the soldiers. There's talk of a military coup in the air, And Washington might have been deposed or set himself as a Caesar, a kind of military dictator, and he could have seized power and forsworn Republican institutions. Instead, he decides to appeal to the soldiers for virtue and self-mastery. And he mounts a wooden platform called the Temple of Virtue. And he reads to them from his favorite play, Addison's Cato, which praises the calm virtues of mild philosophy. And then he says to the soldiers, if only they can wait for a little bit, can manifest the classical virtues of temperance and prudence, then he, Washington, will ensure that they're paid. And he goes to read a letter to prove that he means to make good on this promise. He fumbles to read it, he puts on his reading glasses, and he famously says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep because they've never seen him confess weakness before and manifest this humility. And it's in this moment of calm humility and self-mastery that Washington has never been greater. And he manifests the same self-abnegation, self-mastery when he steps down after 2 terms as president. And the King of France says if he steps down, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And he does, unlike all the dictators and tyrants that have preceded him. And like Cincinnatus, the Roman senator who returns to his farm after his service, Washington is embodying the classical virtues that he's read as a kid in Seneca's letters, which he especially loves. So he represents the classical ideals better than anyone. In his farewell address, which is upstairs, there's a contemporary printing of it in gorgeous shape, thanks to the great Lyman Trumbull, the president of the society who got all these documents. Washington expresses concern that the Republic will fall and will go the way of Greece and Rome unless citizens can manifest virtuous self-mastery. And by that he means that citizens have to demonstrate the personal self-government that's necessary for political self-government. They have to manifest the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, or else they will descend into factions and the mob. Rome fell because the citizens were so greedy that they succumbed to Caesar's bribes of bread and circus and surrendered their liberties in exchange for cheap luxuries. They couldn't control their impulses and were so greedy for immediate gratification that they gave up the Constitution itself. And Washington, explicitly embracing this classical model, warns Americans not to gratify their immediate partisan and factional interest rather than thinking of the public good, of the Union. His devotion is to the Union above all. As in his circular letter to the states, he expressed the fervent prayer that Americans would put their devotion to the Union and the public interest above faction and their self-interest. So he appeals to Americans today. He's not sure that the experiment will succeed, but he thinks that we'll fall unless we can manifest this virtuous self-mastery. I know that you're hearing the resonances to today when we have the same fears as Americans have from the beginning. And this was the central fear of the Constitutional Convention. And when Washington summoned Hamilton and Madison to Annapolis, to the Annapolis Convention in 1786, he and the other founders were worried about Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, where mobs of debtors and farmers who couldn't pay their debts mobbed the courthouses and shut down the bankruptcy courts, and then mobbed the Federal Armory, which was the largest collection of militia weapons in the Union, because they couldn't pay their debts. And Washington is concerned that there's no state authority to put down the insurrection, and he and then Madison and Hamilton summon delegates to Philadelphia to create a central government strong enough to achieve common purposes like putting down domestic and foreign insurrection and also raising taxes to achieve common purposes, but also restrained enough to protect liberty. And Madison in particular reads about the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. Jefferson sends him 2 trunkfuls of books from Paris, and Madison, with his scholarly devotion to primary sources, takes notes about why the failed ancient confederacies fell. And he concludes, again, that it was a constitution that prevented a separation of powers and allowed one order, the monarchy or aristocracy or democracy, to get the upper hand and to descend into its opposite, monarchy into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and democracy into the mob. Madison is getting this from Polybius, who has a theory called anacyclosis, and it's the idea that a pure government that's not mixed by the other orders will descend into its degenerate form, and it's always happened before. So Madison's solution, which he gets from Montesquieu, is separation of powers. And the idea is by not allowing one branch or order to predominate, but by ensuring that each of the branches check and balance each other, and there's a horizontal division among the branches of the federal government and a vertical division between federal and state power, we ensure that we, the people, have the power. The power is not in Parliament or in the king or in the Pope or in a prelate, which is the previous ancient idea of authority, but in we the people. And we parcel it out to our representatives, retaining the ultimate authority to ourselves, and we manifest this popular sovereignty in the Constitution itself. And that's the whole point of the Constitution, because it's popularly ratified. It speaks for we the people in the way that our temporary representatives and servants never can. And when there's a clash between the will of the people represented in the Constitution and the will of our servants and delegates represented by ordinary laws, judges prefer the master to the servant, the principal to the agent, as Hamilton put it in Federalist 78. That's all of Constitutional Law 101, and it's the entire principle of the Constitution. And it's based on this shared idea of checks and balances. Now, Madison is also moderately optimistic at the end of his life about a new technology, the broadside press. And when he wonders whether or not citizens will find the virtuous self-mastery to educate themselves, to read primary sources, and to make up their own minds, he's encouraged that this new technology will allow complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to circulate in newspapers like the Pennsylvania Packet. You have upstairs the Pennsylvania Packet copy of the Declaration and the Constitution. Those documents are printed in, or they're ratified in Independence Hall, and then days later, they're printed in the newspapers without ads. And the Federalist Papers are also printed in the newspapers. And Madison believes that when citizens like us read these documents and take the time to absorb their arguments and carefully read the text, we'll be able to make up our own mind. We'll resist the impulse to be guided by passion rather than reason. Madison's also encouraged by the large size of America. Montesquieu had said you could only have a republic in a small community where people knew each other and could deliberate face to face. But Madison is worried that in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. He thinks that actually size is a good thing in America, because with the system of representation, you don't need face-to-face deliberation. Plus, the country's so big that it'll be really hard for mobs to find each other. And by the time they do, they're just going to get tired and go home. So that's why we won't have Shays' Rebellion, because you have to travel over such long distances. So the combination of the big republic and citizens reading primary texts in the newspapers will allow reason to rule and to slowly and coolly diffuse across the land. Okay, friends, I just gave you as economically as I could the whole theory of the way the Constitution is supposed to work. I think we can agree on a nonpartisan basis that our current republic is not exactly Madison's dream, and in fact, in many ways represents Madison's nightmare. We have, most of all, a media environment where posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason, where Enraged to Engage ensures that people are encouraged to tweet and post and express their angriest, most factionate emotions, to own the libs or own the conservatives rather than listening to the other side and to deliberating. And most important, and I really think that this is a heart of the problem, the fact that citizens are not reading anymore. I have to say that because of our addictions to these screens, many of us are not reading books and are not taking the time to read the complicated arguments on both sides and to engage in lifelong learning. And this is the takeaway for me of that crazy COVID reading project that I can't believe I did and won't do again. I did get back into the habit of daily reading, which I lost because I'm addicted to screens. And I did a lot of reading as a kid and in school. but I stopped doing that, and I still read for deadlines, but I'm spending so much time on email and, you know, doing blogs and whatever, fooling myself into thinking that that's reading books, and it's not. So I have a new rule that I want to share with you, which is that when I wake up in the morning, not 2 hours before dawn, but hopefully before the sunrise, I have to read books before I'm allowed to browse or surf. And you know, it can be a half hour or an hour, but it's just a practice that really has changed my life. I learned something every day. I was able to write this other book about Hamilton and Jefferson, which was so exciting. And I feel like it is a path of lifelong learning, which really represents the pursuit of happiness. Even if the whole rest of the day is, I make a hash of it, or I waste it, or you know, at least I've learned something, and it's just a great commitment. So I'm sharing this. If you find, I know many of you, my experience is, many of us do have morning practices of prayer, of meditation, of creative work, of just somehow getting off the screens and getting out of our selfish, ego-based selves and learning and growing and connecting to something larger than ourselves. So it's a great habit. And I do feel that without engagement in our primary texts, we're going to be in trouble. And that's why the National Constitution Center has put online an amazing new civic toolkit for America 250, which convenes America's greatest historians to write about the big ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution. Listen to this lineup: Gordon Wood on government by consent, Danielle Allen on equality, Robbie George on liberty. Akhil Amar has annotated the entire Declaration of Independence clause by clause. There are questions for teachers in the classroom and for parents to talk to kids for intergenerational learning. It's all free and online. It's going to be a paperback published by Simon & Schuster in May. I'm so glad that the great teachers, 17 in Green Bay and 30 here today, are piloting this toolkit with their classes. I want you to check it out, talk to your kids about it. It's just so exciting to learn from these great historians. And I believe that it's our duty. It's not just an opportunity we have, but it's a responsibility. And I think rather than telling you about Hamilton and Jefferson, which you now have, I'd love to talk to you about what I learned about them in question and answer, but I want to close by saying that really learning about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, it's not just a right, but it's a responsibility and a duty. And we started off our talk, you know, why does history matter? It's interesting, the stories are riveting, it's complicated and it's engaging, but unless we learn about these struggles to preserve the great ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration, then we'll make the same mistakes of our predecessors in previous republics and go the way of Greece and Rome and surrender this precious achievement of liberty which has sustained us for 250 years. I want to share with you this statement that John Quincy Adams made on the 50th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration, the Jubilee of the Constitution. Civil war is brewing. He accurately predicts that the country may tear apart over slavery. He says the only thing that will save us from disunion and bloodshed is not only learning about, but cleaving to the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And then he quotes the book of Deuteronomy. He says, take these principles of the Declaration and the Constitution and put them as frontlets between your eyes. Bind them to your hands and arms. Place them upon your doorposts. Whisper them to your children before you sleep. Make them the principles of your political salvation. That is how important it is for us to learn about these inspiring principles, and that's why it's so inspiring that all of you turned out to talk about history, and that's why I'm so honored to talk to you. Thank you so much.